Hi, this video is Annotations applied to language objectives. This video has been created for students in Webster University's Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages program. So if you've not already done so, please watch the video Annotations for Lesson Plans and Other Instructional Materials before watching this video. The content from that video is going to be applied specifically to language objectives that are part of lesson plans for English learners. So, objectives are extremely important to have in lesson plans. So, when writing lesson plans for English learners, you should consider writing both content objectives and language objectives. So the content objectives are going to focus on the curriculum content for the class. If you're a teacher based in Missouri, you would look at the Missouri Learning Standards from DESE. In other locations, you could look at institutional or program standards. There are different national standards that you may have in your country, or different standards from frameworks or other major assessments. And there will be a slide later in this presentation that will list some ideas for those. Then your language objectives should go beyond learning and using vocabulary. So these should also go beyond the use of sentence stems or sentence frames. While those can be helpful, what we want to do is help our learners acquire different aspects of the language that will help them be independent users of the English language. So when you're creating your language objectives, try to think linguistically as you are writing them. So, as you're writing your language objectives, consider how you address the four skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. That's one good place to start. Also, think about how you'll address language as a system or how you'll look at focus on form. And the reason for this is you want to ensure that your English learners are able to notice, acquire, practice, use, and eventually master the linguistic aspects required to understand content, to demonstrate comprehension, to communicate as needed, and to perform required functions for the lesson. If you're trying to think of different topics that you might be able to use for language objectives, there's a chart that's here that will also be made available in the Canvas classroom to help you out as you try to come up with ideas for language objectives. But this can include things such as looking at root words, affixes, so prefixes and suffixes that you may be able to use, focusing on verbs, also looking at verbs plus particles. This is something that is often a struggle for learners of all levels. Focusing on nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, looking at different forms of negation in English, and then also focusing on question words. Articles in English are always a challenge for English learners, so you can always focus on those. The pronoun system of English can also be challenging. The use of passive voice, different connectors, looking at relative clauses, focusing on conditionals such as our if clauses, focusing on comparatives and superlatives, and then different discourse markers that your learners may need to use. So when you're doing this, consider different standards. So what are the different available, published, or required standards that you need to look at? And then see if you can align your objectives to those standards. With that, then consider the language that's needed to demonstrate proficiency with these standards. That will help you when you are crafting your objectives. So, some different standards, frameworks, and assessments that may be helpful for you to look at based on your context are the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So, whether your students are at an A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, what level they're at, and what level they're moving to. The WIDA can do descriptors. So, in the K through 12 schools in Missouri, the WIDA can do descriptors are often used. ACTFL has performance descriptors. Then there are different performance descriptors for the TOEFL. IELTS also has its scoring information that you can use that will describe what learners of English or users of English are able to do. Then ELPA 21 is another framework that is similar to WIDA, but it's used in other states in the United States. And then the Canadian language benchmarks, which are used in Canada for English and for French, can also be a useful tool. So the next few slides are going to show some example standards and some language objectives that can be derived from those standards. So these are going to be academic standards that come from the Missouri Learning Standards. But you can take content objectives of any kind and then derive language objectives from them. So let's take an example of a second grade science standard. Plan and conduct an investigation to describe and classify different kinds of materials by their observable properties. And then there's a clarification statement here. Observations could include color, texture, hardness, and flexibility. Patterns could include the similar properties that different materials share. Now, this expressed as a content objective could be students will be able to, that's what the SWBAT, SWABA, students will be able to plan and conduct an investigation to describe and classify different kinds of materials by their observable properties. So some possible language objectives, and these objectives are differentiated based on different language levels. So depending on your learners, if they are lower level, if they're newcomers, if they're higher level, and you may even need to use more than one of these within the same class because you may need to differentiate your instruction. So for newcomers or low level students, students will be able to circle color words that could be used to describe and classify objects. Notice how this language objective is annotated with R for reading. Then for mid-level students, students will be able to list words of comparison, for example, harder, rougher, lighter, to use in describing and classifying objects. This language objective is annotated for writing and focus on form, because a focus on comparatives, so using the ER ending or using more plus an adjective, is a focus on form topic. And then for higher level students, students will be able to use multiple kinds of comparative words and phrases to compare and contrast objects as part of a classification. And so here, this is a writing objective with also focus on form. Now, if we take a grade 5, a 5th grade math standard, write, evaluate, and interpret numeric expressions using the order of operations. Expressed as a content objective, this would be students will be able to write, evaluate, and interpret numeric expressions using the order of operations. So in this case, the content objective is the same as the standard that is written by DESE in the Missouri Learning Standards. Some possible language objectives for newcomers or low-level students. Students will be able to label various operations by name, copying the letters, symbol, copying the symbol, and order using Arabic numerals. This one is annotated for R for reading and W for writing, because the students are reading and then they have to write by copying the letters and even writing the numerals. For higher level students, students will be able to describe orally to another student the proper order of operations for a formula using discourse markers of order. For example, first, first of all, then, next, after. This language objective is annotated for S, speaking, and F, focus on form. Now let's take a kindergarten English language arts standard. With assistance, read, infer, and draw conclusions to ask and answer questions about unknown words in a text. As a content objective, this could be students will be able to read, infer, and draw conclusions to ask and answer questions about unknown words in a text. So this is pretty much taking the standard from the Missouri Learning Standards, just taking out the with assistance part. So possible language objectives, with this being kindergarten, this is assuming that everyone would need to do this. Students will be able to identify unfamiliar words in writing by pointing or underlining. This one is annotated for R, reading. And then students will be able to ask for the meaning of an unfamiliar word with, what does blank mean? This is annotated for speaking because the students need to be able to speak this phrase. So there are two different ways using language that learners can achieve this content objective. So things to remember is that English learners need language skills to be made explicit. Vocabulary is only one piece of the language that English learners need. And if you do not include focus on form, your learners may not learn important linguistic skills in English that are necessary for their academic success. Then also consider backwards design when you plan your objectives, your activities, your explicit instructions, and various tasks. Then also review resources that are in your Canvas classroom for more ideas to help you out with language objectives and for annotations. And here's some of the references that were used through these slides. And thank you very much.